Welcome to Operation Market Garden, tool time style. For those of you who are new to my channel, thank you for dropping in. For those of you who have been here before, you'll probably notice that this video has absolutely nothing to do with fixing up your old car or my old pieces of junk. So this is a hobby of mine, military history. And this is the first in a series of videos that I would like to engage people on various topics related to military history. Before starting, I'd kind of like to throw a little bit of love toward a couple of the guys that I watch on YouTube on a fairly regular basis. I find their work to be interesting, entertaining, and useful. So let's take a quick look. The source of today's discussion, I'm actually going to be talking about one of the videos and the assertions that you'll find over here on TIK History, the Imperator Knight, a guy by the name of Lewis. I don't know his last name, but I do know that he puts in a lot of work into his videos. If you take a look down here, there's a whole slew of detailed videos, and in particular we're going to focus on Market Garden that has kind of evolved over the years for him. He's done some really good work here. Another one I probably reference today real quickly is the Chieftain. Really like his videos. He's does a real good job of explaining different battles, different equipment, that sort of thing. Just find him to be quite informative. And for those of you who are kind of interested in the Ukraine war and a little bit more detail, I really like this guy Perun. I don't know what his name is, his real name is, but he does some really thorough research, comes to some reasonable conclusions. You know, he's not trying to force you to believe his point of view. But lays out some really good information for you that helps you frame the Ukraine conflict that are going on. So these are some of the guys who sort of have inspired me. And, you know, up until this point, I haven't done any videos. At least not any videos in the military history, current affairs, that sort of realm. So these are guys that I kind of look up to, among others, in part because of the thoroughness of which they do their research, and the conclusions they draw, I think, are well thought out. Whether you agree with them or not, they're well thought out and generally well documented. So today I'm going to be making my first attempt to engage the discussion and hopefully start some new discussions of my own with the viewers here regarding Operation Market Garden. I've got the links on the board, and I'll make sure that they're included down in the description. The gist of his series is one of the first video up there is a very detailed sort of step-by-step chronological thing with the map, shows you what's going on. And for those of you who don't have a lot of familiarity with Operation Market Garden, it's an excellent review. Some of his subsequent stuff, he gets into kind of trying to analyze why the operation failed. I mean, for those of you who are familiar with it, you send in 3 airborne divisions deep, 30 Corps, British 30 Corps was supposed to roll up this carpet and grab the bridge across the Rhine, and everything was going to be wonderful, kumbaya, we were going to win the war by Christmas, right? At least that's what the movie A Bridge Too Far opening narrative would have you believe. One of the key takeaways from TIK's review is to more or less isolate what he views as the critical event, the Nijmegen Bridge operation, and the decisions around it and the effects that it has on the overall operation. and he draws some conclusions. And we'll talk about them in a minute. And then he does a book review, and then there at the bottom I've included a reference to his Need a Break video. And the reason I include that link is because not long ago, a couple months ago, he was really kind of down in the dumps, and he was sort of beating his head against the wall, trying to inform and educate and engage people whose minds were already made up, basically. And he was just struggling. It was like, what do I have to do to convince these people? I want to say that he was focused on progressives and socialists and leftists in his frustration. But no matter how many citations he made, he was really struggling. And I've watched a lot of his videos over the years, and it's sort of the frustration level has built up. And I kind of empathize with him, because in this one time where I reach out to engage him on a topic, I've been involved in a series of threads, a thread with a series of different folks on the conversation. And you just run into this, I'm here to prove a point kind of people, right? And so you can really relate to, it's like, how do we have an open, meaningful discussion where we exchange views and we learn from each other, and we analyze what happened, why did it happen, what was the information around the decisions that made it happen, what were the consequences, and then, to me, sort of the blame game is sort of the last step. Okay, once you've laid out all the consequences, okay, well, who actually made that decision? Then, of course, they, or whoever was a part of that, gets the blame or the glory, whichever. So as I watched this video or series of videos on A Bridge Too Far and basically Operation Market Garden, he came to some interesting conclusions, and I'll talk about what I thought, and then what unfolded from there, which is the impetus behind me doing this video. Now, I'm going to take my ugly mug off here, and I got the Army t-shirt, been there, got the t-shirt kind of thing. I'm not going to get into my resume too much, except I'll just give you a little highlight. I started off as a private, ended up as a full colonel, did a fair number of years in National Guard, had multiple deployments on active duty, tours. I've done some peacekeeping, some combat operations, some advising at all various different ranks. And so as we look at this, I approached this discussion of Operation Market Garden from someone with a fair amount of operational experience. I was an operations officer at various levels, and I'm interested personally in the kinds of things that lead to good decisions and bad decisions. And I think this is important in the modern age, because if you look at, whether it's Desert Storm or Afghanistan or Iraq or the new environment with Ukraine and NATO, the coalitions mentality, understanding coalition operations, especially multi-echelon coalition operations, to me is an important thing. Now, granted, I'm retired, so it's not like I'm going to make a lot of difference, but I like to have the discussion to understand how we can do better, how we can make better decisions, recognize better options, work together. Two people separated by a similar common language, that kind of thing. So that's a little bit about where I come from. I do have a degree in military history, but from the perspective of this, from the perspective of a video blogger, whatever you want to call it, and a historian, I want to make sure that you sort of understand that I come at this as sort of a well-informed enthusiast. I don't have the time or probably even the inclination to do the level of detail of research that Lewis does. And so I want to give full faith and credit to these other guys who are making a living doing this. And kudos to everything that they're doing. I got nothing but good things to say about them. Okay, with that said, let's go ahead and kind of talk about this series. Basically, TIK has a review, and where he talks about, in particular, the operations on the bridges around Nijmegen, and the decisions that General Gavin makes, and goes from there. And he basically blames Gavin, and to a large degree, I agree. But with anything, there are certain caveats to that, and there's also some other considerations. He talks about the bad plan, badly executed narrative that most of us are sort of familiar with from Cornelius Ryan. And, he thinks that that's, at least my impression is, he thinks that is a faulty or outdated narrative. So if I was going to kind of start this, it's like, what is TIK, saying? And then I'm going to tell you what I said. And then we're going to talk about the impetus of this video, and how engaging in, any kind of meaningful dialogue is sometimes hampered by people's biases and agendas. And I have my own biases and agendas. I'm not saying I'm innocent of this, but there, it's sometimes very difficult to have conversations, especially when you're doing one post every 12 hours. If you're talking with someone on the other side of the world. So let's take a look at what TIK asserts in these series of videos. Of course, the one video he just outlines the main operation, but he talks about General Gavin's blame factor in terms of the decision to deprioritize the immediate selection of the Nijmegen bridges on day one in favor of securing the Groesbeek hikes. So this is a scenario where the 82nd Airborne has a reported threat to the east, and rather than go grab the bridge, they set up defensive positions on Groesbeek Heights, and then they missed the opportunity to grab the bridge. And he talks about the relatively speaking, the non-existent threat that is in the Reichswald, and that the delay of the capturing the bridges early on day one is why 30 Corps was late to Arnhem. Another one of his general themes is that 30 Corps was not slow as depicted in the movie A Bridge Too Far and Cornelius Ryan's book. I think he makes some really good points here. The delay at the San Bridge were basically made up by the time they got to Nijmegen. And the delay really occurs at Nijmegen Bridge, okay? And 30 Corps was there waiting, so, of course, that leads to the view that this is all the 82nd Airborne's fault. They didn't get the bridge, so now there's this delay. 30 Corps wasn't slow. At least, he and I agree on that, and we'll talk about that a little more later. And then the last sort of takeaway that I get from him is that, the bad plan, badly executed narrative is outdated. That it's mainly intended to shift the blame on the Monty and 30 Corps, which I think he's accurately making that assessment. I think there is some of that involved. That the narrative is intentionally, shielding U.S. mistakes and failures, and except for the Nijmegen decision, the plan was otherwise sound. So this is where we're going to start to disagree a little bit. I tend to agree with him on the first 2 points, that the narrative does mask the American contributions to failure, but the plan was not sound. So we'll talk about, or at least not in my opinion. So with that said, let's kind of take a look at what did I think, all right? And what started me down the road of producing this general video. At one point in the conversation, I posted my thread out to him, and I posted a couple of comments, and there was an exchange in which people were discussing the Reichswald threat. Just to the east of the 82nd Airborne, there was this this supposed tank force. And TIK gets into a point at one of his videos about this claim that Gavin makes, that there was 1,000 tanks sitting over there in the Reichswald, and it's not entirely clear where that narrative comes from. The 1,000 tank myth comes from. But my assertion, in largely agreeing with Lewis on his blame game, if you will, is look, if you have 1,000 tanks, when you read Gavin's statements, when you read that Gavin acknowledges that himself that he changed the priorities and got Browning to agree to changing priorities, when you read all these things together, what you find is that Gavin made a decision to deprioritize the bridges in favor of securing the Groesbeek Heights, and he got Browning to agree for it, to go along with it. And so collectively, in my view, that if you're looking for a single point failure, that's where the blame lies, is with these two guys. But as with anything, there's a caveat. So I'm going to address sort of the main themes that went through my commentary with various folks over several days and weeks. The first thing is, it was a bad plan and it was badly executed. It's not an outdated narrative. The problem is that just because it was a bad plan doesn't mean it wouldn't work. There's an axiom of war: a bad plan boldly executed is better than a good plan that's never executed, or something to that effect. But the key phrase is bad plan boldly executed. The problem was, this was a bad plan badly executed. And, no matter how much you do, you got to have some degree of functionality in that boldness. So the narrative is not wrong. The shifting of the blame onto 30 Corps, which is the second point, and saying that they were slow, is not really fair, to be honest, at least not in my view. When you look at how quickly they advanced, it just doesn't really hold up to muster. But, once again, there were operational mistakes within 30 Corps, and I'm not talking about the, not getting the boats forward, for the amphibious operation, or not building the Bailey Bridge fast enough at the Son Bridge. And there were other mistakes that we'll talk about in a few minutes that impacted the success. And it's like, so it wasn't a question of being slow as so much as the plan causes the next thing, which is causes Gavin and Gavin and Browning to make the decision to deprioritize the bridge in favor of the Groesbeek Heights security. Basically, they have to choose between securing the bridges. They don't have enough. Gavin doesn't have the resources to capture all of the objectives immediately, and so he decides that he's going to secure the heights, basically protect his flank, and then he'll go after the bridge. So you'll notice above I say the blame in purple. It says solely, right? The blame is solely on these guys. And down here at the bottom, I'm going to slightly amend that to be significantly to blame. The distinction will be in pre-operational planning versus post H-hour execution. Gavin's mistake of prioritizing the heights is the last straw in a long string of bad decisions. Any one of those decisions before we get to this point might have changed the entire dynamic of the 82nd Airborne Operations decision to prioritize the heights. So it is, while he is, when it gets down to actual execution and the troops are, boots are on the ground, it becomes the sole, mistake, if you will, that that matters. But it's a mistake that only manifests itself after layers of mistake upon mistake upon mistake. So it's sort of like I say, the last straw. And one of the last themes that I have is in my narratives, or my commentary, is Montgomery shares some culpability. And I bring this up because there are people out there who try and exonerate one side or the other. And there's one of these guys is just like, oh, Montgomery walks on water, blah, blah, blah. But this is one of those examples where no one's narrative is completely accurate. Montgomery has some culpability, but he is not the sole blame of failure, at least not from my point of view. And remember, I'm an American, okay? And a lot of this commentary, whether there's blame that's directed at Montgomery or someone else, is nationalistic in nature. And this kind of goes back to the point that I made earlier about coalition operations, right? Multi-echelon coalition operations. I really believe that we need to understand that America, Europe, Britain, Canada, Australia, the Kiwis, in particular Japanese, we need to understand coalition operations because we live in a very dangerous time. I think almost as dangerous as World War II, and of course with the nuclear aspects of it, obviously potentially more dangerous. So I think it's very important we understand this. And when we get into the blame game, we tend to lose track of reality. The blame should be the last thing we discuss. So that's my commentary. And in the course of this, I had some conversations with a whole series of guys. The first guy to engage me was a Yank. His name was Big Woody. And to be honest, he's one of these guys that Montgomery's to blame for everything, right? And whatever Montgomery didn't screw up, Browning, Horrocks, and Urquhart were responsible for. And Gavin and the 82nd were heroic dudes. And it's like, okay. He and I went back and forth. I found Big Woody's commentary to be helpful. He had quite a few pieces of information that I hadn't read about, things like that. But I think that he fails to appreciate, at least in my opinion, some of the constraints that the British were operating under, and doesn't seem to acknowledge that Americans contributed to anything to the failure. Everyone's entitled to their opinion. We went back and forth, and at some point, that conversation kind of died out. There was some dialogue, and that was the key. It was a conversation worth having. To me, it was a little more difficult because I wasn't interested in blame. I was more interested in, what happened, why did it happen, what were the decisions, and he seemed to be a little more interested in the blame game. But collectively, we did come away with, some interaction that was worth having. Then come the Allies. Let's start on the left. I don't remember the guy's name. It was an Aussie. Engaged in conversation, and I found him to be the most sane. Right, this is a guy who actually sees both sides of it in terms of the perspective of decisions of who was making the decisions, what were the consequences. It was to him that engagement seemed to be more about learning. And then comes the Brit. Wow. This is the guy that caused me to contemplate even doing a video in the first place. First of all, you can't engage with a couple of exchanges every 24 hours in any kind of meaningful conversation. And this guy's name or call sign or whatever is John Burns. And with due respect, he's borderline troll. Lots and lots and lots of great quotes, right? Mostly it comes from Ryland's book, Neil Ryland's book, and the U.S. Army Official History. Okay, almost all of his quotes came from there, one of those two sources. And Nyland has an agenda, and the American Army, it's not done by an author, right? It's done by a collective of staff officers, and so it doesn't have the same kind of personalized one theme message kind of authorship. So it's a lot more like a collection of facts and reports and things of that nature. So it is a narrative. It's a pretty decent document. I have read some of it. Obviously, I haven't read the whole thing, but when you look at the interaction between the two of us that went on for a couple weeks, literally every single American you can imagine was in the blame game. The Americans had 100% accountability, and with he does throw London under the bus. I'll show you that in a minute. But otherwise, I could not detect a single acknowledgement of any wrongdoing or mistake or misjudgment or malice or ill will or incompetence or anything on the British side. Right? So it was really interesting to see. You got the Yank who pretty much blames the Brits. You got the Brit who absolutely blames the Americans, and then you got the Aussie who's kind of like, yeah, well, this was an interesting point that I learned, and our conversation was actually pretty good. Now I want to talk about the troll, right? The Brit, John Burns. Why do I call him a troll? I mean, that's kind of a harsh thing to say about somebody, but I'm going to throw this one up right off the bat. This was pretty late in the exchange when I started to shut it down, and Big Woody jumps in and throws in some commentary, and John and he kind of get into a little, exchange going back and forth. And you could see right off the bat, Rambo, and I think Big Woody calls Burns burning boy or something like that. You start getting into name calling, and right off the bat, it's not an exchange that's probably going to be overly productive. Okay, but this is important because if you look there at the top, the thing that sort of ends the discussion with John Burns is when I kind of point out, I was starting to get this, I wasn't starting, there was a theme of America's guilty, America's guilty, America's guilty, Britain's innocent, oh, we're just a bunch of good soldiers, blah, blah, blah. And finally I was just like, well, okay, your agenda's clear, thanks, we're not going to have this conversation anymore. And he comes back with this holier than thou, my agenda is facts. I'm like, well, that's a load of shit, okay, with due respect. And this one was an exchange that was between him and Big Woody and not me. Notice that he talks about Operation Market Garden and the U.S. 7th Armored that fails to seize this particular town. What was the name? And he was basically he was insulting Big Woody over a series of things, and finally he comes up with the Battle of Overloon. Like, okay, now two things about the Battle of Overloon. It was after Operation Market Garden. It was after the extraction of British Airborne from Arnhem. So, who cares? What difference does this discussion, this point, have to do with Operation Market Garden? Now, he claims it was part of Market Garden, and he claims that the 7th U.S. Armor failed to seize it. Okay, so now let's take a look at Overloon, where it is relative to the corridor. Using Google, the blue route there is the approximate path of 30 Corps. Overloon has absolutely no bearing on the fight that was the key battle. Up in here you have up in here is Nijmegen. There's Nijmegen. Here's the road bridge. Here's the railroad bridge. Grave is right here. Here's the water canal with the human bridge and the three other bridges that were in their landing zone. And off to the east is, I think this is the area that they were referring to as the Reichswald. It's labeled in another graphic. And so this is the battle space where the critical event occurs, where the 82nd Airborne is prioritizing defense against this imagined threat from the east over securing the bridges. Like, okay, so Overloon occurs after the battle and is, 50 miles away? Okay, facts mean nothing if they're irrelevant. If I walk out onto my porch and I look up and the sky is blue and there are no clouds and the temperature is pleasant and it's low humidity, and I say the weather is wonderful, okay, that's fine. Now let's go down the road a mile to a farmer who steps out and he looks up at that same blue sky with no clouds and low humidity and moderate temperature, and then he looks down at the ground and sees his crops, which are dead because he's in the middle of a 10-year drought. Do you think that his context for those facts is the same as mine? Do you think that he looks up and sees that as wonderful weather, or maybe a little bit of light rain would be pretty good from his point of view? So facts are necessary. We need to have facts as foundational, but context does matter. And this, when you start to get on your high horse, you start to lose credibility. And so the rest of this video, I'm going to kind of talk about some of the accusations that were undercutting my position, if you will, and how when you view things through this nationalistic lens, you don't get a proper picture, and you can't make, at least in my opinion, you can't make good judgments about the battle and the leaders and the decision makers. So if I was to summarize John's grievances and sort of prioritize the top 3 or 4, this is the way I would summarize the 2 weeks of engagement. Basically, Americans are to blame for everything. Americans withheld resources, and therefore it failed. Americans failed to secure the flanks, and America failed in their easy missions, where, of course, the British mission was the hard mission. Okay, so I've included these and highlighted in red the British and in blue the Americans to sort of give you a sense of some of his commentary. And when you look at this, if you want to stop and freeze the frame, you'll see there's some of this stuff there are some valid points in here, right? This is a guy who has the potential to engage in a meaningful conversation, but he skews everything. In between every one of his quotes, he injects his opinion where he takes that fact that he just presented and puts it in a context that it's like, okay, this just doesn't work. Okay, so I'm going to pluck a couple of these out here. You can stop and watch, like I say, review these others. And this is, again, to give you a sense of some of the interactions. So Monty is far less accountable than Eisenhower. Okay, now going back to my Army t-shirt. Whatever you want to say, Eisenhower has a higher, more general overview of the activity. And, I would get operations orders from higher that I didn't like. But when they, as an operations officer at the battalion level, the brigade would send me something I didn't like. Okay, but if I'm the execution headquarters, if I'm responsible, it does not matter whether I like the order or whether I think it's optimum or not. You don't become less accountable. The President of the United States and the Prime Minister, the buck stops there, right? They are responsible. But as you get closer and closer to the battle zone, the fact of the matter is accountability increases every step you go down that ladder, because it's Major Cook who's crossing the Wall River in the boats with his men, where the rubber meets the road. he is accountable with his life, right? It's just in the military, that's the way it works. You can't say Monty is far less accountable. Okay, and then he throws in, well, he undersources the resourcing of this thing, and then he, throws Brereton under the bus, and Eisenhower was his boss. Oh, and Monty was the good professional soldier who always obeyed his orders. Now, for those of you who are not Americans, you might not know the story about the point where General Eisenhower was getting upbraided by Montgomery in Europe, and he finally had to say, Monty, you can't talk to me like that. I'm your boss, right? Monty had the power to influence all the decisions that were affecting British forces. He was one of the top 3 commanders in the theater. Eisenhower was the supreme commander. Bradley was the American commander and under Eisenhower, and Montgomery was the highest ranking British commander. To suggest that he was just along for the ride is just fundamentally, and had no say, and he just had to obey orders, and that he always did, is just hogwash. Okay. Going to drop down here. You notice that he throws London under the bus here a little bit, basically throwing Churchill under the bus and saying, well, they got what they wanted. We're going to talk about the strategic view in a minute. And yes, they did get what they wanted. It's like, okay, so this is fine, but it's almost like when you read it in context of his other messages, it's almost like they're to blame because they got what they wanted. I was like, well, yeah, they got what they wanted. They're directing the war, and it's our job as subordinates to make it happen. Okay, he throws in Brereton and Williams again, and then now I'm going to start talking about some of the disparagement aspects of his commentary. Failure of an execution that 2 easy bridges were not seized by U.S. paras, but of course, everything that the British did was hard, and everything that the Americans did was easy. And, it only failed because of whatever. And then he throws in the narrative that it was 90% successful. It failed by a whisker, and it was all 182nd, 101st fault. And well, first of all, anyone who thinks that 90% of a fail, this is a yes-no operation. You either get across the Rhine or you don't. Eventually, 30 Corps was going to advance to the Rhine River in a slow, methodical way that would have not necessarily been as risky. So this whole 90% thing, let's face it, everyone knows Market Garden was a failure, and this British narrative that it was 90% successful is a load of crap. Okay. Oh, Hodges. Okay, who the hell's Hodges? Well, Hodges is the American general to the south. Bradley is to the south. And they're disobeying orders and stealing supplies and giving them to Patton. What? Now Patton is guilty. This is all Patton's fault. And then he goes on to say, okay, Hodges was spread out and he was giving supplies to Patton. Patton should have been fired. And yet, okay, remember, he basically says, John Burns is saying at one point that the Americans failed to produce even a single division, right? He could not give even a division for Market Garden. Yet earlier, you remember I pointed back up to the irrelevant fact. Remember, the 7th Armor was somewhere up in Overloon. Now, we didn't do so good, apparently, at Overloon. But in his own words, Operation Overloon, 7th Armor, was part of Operation Market Garden, but we couldn't spare a division. So his facts were inconsistent. And okay, so we're going along. All right. So in one of the commentary along the way is, I pointed out, kind of related to the good plan theory, good plan, bad plan theory, that I think that when you put 10,000 men on the far side of 3,000-foot span bridges and 2 other large water barriers, I think that's not a good plan. Okay, and maybe somewhere down the road we can have that conversation. To which he replies, "It was thought to be a good plan, blah, blah, blah. The road from Arnhem, from the San River, basically Eindhoven to Arnhem, was devoid of troops. Non-combat troops in Nijmegen with no bridge defenses, blah, blah, blah." Okay, it's funny. As I recall, the 9th and 10th Panzer were known to be in Arnhem from two distinctly different intelligence sources, the first being the RAF reconnaissance photographs, and from the Dutch underground. And it's like, okay, maybe you don't trust the Dutch, but you have your own photos, and you have two independent sources telling you that the 9th and 10th Panzer are there, and maybe they are degraded, but there are combat forces right in the midst of your plan. And oh, by the way, we're going to come back to the large armored force in the vicinity of the Reichwald and the 1,000 tank myth. It's not entirely clear if the 1,000 tanks number was thrown around prior or if it was after, but there was an intelligence report of large tank formation in the Reichswald area. So this notion that the road was, basically open is hogwash. There were two divisions sitting on the objective and one on the flank, or I should say one large formation on the flank. 1,000 tanks actually equates to two pre-war panzer divisions or thereabouts. And it probably was the equivalent of four 1944 panzer divisions because they reorganized to a binary system part of the way through the war. So whether it's, the point is, there were a crap load of tanks that were known to be in and on the corridor. So here we go again. When you start throwing, quote, facts around that are not based in reality, you start to lose your credibility. And then the final straw, I think, is, we start to get really personal. His Uncle Jimmy, I'm not sure who Uncle Jimmy was, but Uncle Jimmy had little respect for the 82nd Airborne, as many were running south away from Nijmegen. And as we come down here, the amphibious assault performed by the 82nd was only a diversion. Its prime reason was to save Gavin's face. Like, okay, so now we're starting to call into question, the courage. I'm no Browning fan, but Browning was the guy who made the decision to allow Gavin to do this. He turned down the amphibious assault once. You're telling me that Browning was going to let the British Airborne die on the vine just to save Gavin's face? There comes a point at which you got to tell a troll, go pound sand. And to be honest, it took till about this point to understand that he was a troll. I mean, let's face it. When you're talking about people's, their motives, their professionalism, their competence, and you're calling them out as basically as cowards, which he denied in a subsequent. I never said they were cowards. It's like, well, when you say when you're talking about 82nd guys running away from the battle, you're not exactly implying that they're brave, heroic men, right? So this was the stuff that as I went along, I started to feel, going back to the one of the opening slides there with TIK's frustration. He needed a break because he deals with, as a full-time blogger or vlogger, whatever they call him now, every day he's got, guys like this throwing lots of facts up on the boards, some of which are irrelevant, some of which are not correct, and most of them which are simply out of context or don't necessarily come to the right conclusions, if you will. I was starting to realize, oh my God, I could never be a full-time video guy. So I have immense respect. I have more respect for TIK or for Lewis and the guys who do this full-time than I ever did before. Okay, so now we're well into this, and I'm going to kind of go through real quickly, my counters to those four main arguments that he was making, that Americans are to blame, that that the operations were easy, etc. If you look at the command structure, Simple fact is, this is kind of how I break it down. Strategic level, you got Montgomery and Eisenhower. Operational level, you got the Army and Corps commander types, and then the rubber meets the road is going to be the tactical. Now, that may not be perfectly doctrinally correct, but that's how I'm going to do it. And at the strategic level, you're talking about doing things like you're evaluating the strategic concepts and plans and who's going to get priority. At operational level, you're starting to put the plans together and actually maybe execute them depending on what level it is. And then the tactical guys are the ones who are putting the plan, rubber meets the road, putting the plan into play. And if you look at this, you'll notice in red, the British guys and that are pertinent to the discussion, and the blue are the Americans. Now, in the blame game, I personally think that it stops at this point right here. Yeah, we can blame Montgomery. Yeah, we can blame Bradley, and we can blame Eisenhower for different aspects of this. I think the most culpable of the three would be Montgomery, because it was in his sector. Any way you slice it, trying to blame Patton, who's 300 miles away, for something that happens in your sector, unless there's a very clear, distinct link, it just doesn't make sense. But with that said, I think personally I view the mistakes to occur more or less in the operational level, the key mistakes to be in the operational level and below. So if it were up to me, I would probably say the blame game starts at this point right here and down. So real quick, strategic concept. If you need to stop this, pause the video here, you can look at it. The concept was good. It's right. Concentrate your forces, single axis of advance, get across the Rhine. Okay, turn to the north and open up the Scheldt estuary and get Antwerp in operation. Turn to the south and get to attack the Ruhr, or go east to Berlin. It's the plan that was bad. So when TIK says it was a good plan, I think what he really means is that it was, or I think what he should mean is that conceptually the concept was in fact good. The plan was bad. Now, we're not going to have a chance to discuss in gory detail here today all the different aspects of the bad plan, but some of them, the battlefield geometry, landing the British airborne north of the Rhine, for example, puts them on the far side of 3 1,000-foot spans, irreplaceable in the time allotted, 3 irreplaceable spans. Failures of intelligence, wishing, on the one hand, they wish away the 9th and 10th Panzer to make it justifiable to put British in on the north side. But then on the other hand, they embrace the large armor force on the Reichswall, which changes the whole operational activity for the 82nd Airborne to focus on flank security and deprioritizing the bridge. All right. So on the one hand, we wish it away, and on the other hand, the force that's vague, we're worried about. The force that's defined, we ignore, right? There's lots of issues with the intelligence, but those are probably the two big ones. And then, badly executed. The Nijmegen Bridge deprioritization. Of course, the Somme Bridge and the Best Bridge were defended, and the Somme Bridge was actually destroyed. This kind of gets into that easy thing. The enemy gets a vote. Remember, they get to defend their bridges. They know we want those bridges. So this idea is crazy. And then the last point I'm going to put here, and I want to be very clear about something. The British operation was an utter disaster, and the British never fully secured their bridge. And that has absolutely nothing to do with the heroic actions of Lieutenant Colonel Frost and his men. I personally consider their operations in Arnhem to be one of the seminal moments or operations of British arms in World War II. What they did was amazing. Okay, but it wasn't because the plan north of the Rhine River was any good. Everything about the British operation was a failure, and they never secured both ends of the bridge. And we'll talk in a later video, if there's any engagement off of this video, we'll talk about the effects of securing the south end of the bridge and why that would have been important if 30 Corps had gotten there in time. Okay. 30 Corps was not slow. They were delayed, but generally speaking made up the first delay. Remember, the enemy gets a vote. Nijmegen was, of course, the major delay, and it has to do with that deprioritization, and I do think there is accountability for both Gavin and Browning. And the key on the Nijmegen Bridge is this is the one event, the one flaw that by itself could have changed the fate of the operation. The amount of delay that occurs at Nijmegen by itself puts 30 Corps at the south end of the Arnhem Bridge while John Frost's troops are still on the north end, giving them the best chance of success. So that's the reason, that I don't think that Americans, Big Woody and those guys, I don't think we can dismiss the significance of this decision and the American contribution to that decision, etc. So this is the fatal flaw at the time of execution. If we go back to the battlefield architecture and some other things, there are lots of things that go into getting us there. But once H-hour happens, once we have boots on the ground, this is the only decision that can be changed theoretically. If on the drop zone, Gavin had gone over and told Lundquist, run for the bridge right now, and got him, and we had secured the bridge on day one, this one thing could have been changed. This one result could have been changed. And generally 30 Corps' progress, I think, if you look at it, was good. The flaw that they're guilty of will be in how they handle flank security. But they made timely progress to Eindhoven after the initial delay right off the line where the preliminary defenses were. They pretty much made good their time up to Nijmegen once they got the Somme Bridge replaced. And the fact of the matter is, after Arnhem, the fact that they stopped for tea is irrelevant because 3 hours before that bridge was secured, Frost's bridgehead surrendered. So we can make more out of it than it is, but unfortunately, it was irrelevant at that point. So I'm going to address these real quick in reverse order. I'm going to start with the easy thing, okay? But before we do that, we got to talk about battlefield geometry and some terminology. Okay, so if we're talking about the way flank security is going to work, we're talking about this thing. This is set up with, here at the bottom is 2nd Army. On the left, center, and right, you have the 12th, 30th, and 8th Corps. 30 Corps is going to be on the forward line of troops, and they're going to be departing the line of departure and moving to the limit of advance within their boundaries. Okay, so they have a set of boundaries that it's their territory, and this will go back to one of the discussions about flank security. And the operation for Arnhem occurs inside of their boundaries. Remember, the limit of advance is actually beyond Arnhem. The intent is to get over the bridge, and that's where they would basically come to a pause, secure the bridgehead, and then make the decision of which way to go. So the idea is to push down the road, drop in the airborne, and once you get across, you make the decision to go up to the Zuiderzee and secure the Scheldt estuary, go to the Ruhr to the south, or proceed on to the east. So this is sort of the orientation, and if you look off here on the right side, there's an entire corps, the 8th British Corps, on the right flank of the 30 Corps, and then the U.S. Army, 1st Army is off to the right of that, and then way over there is U.S. 3rd Army, which is under Patton. Okay, and if you lay it out on the map, you can see right here, right in this upper northeast corner is the jump-off point for 30 Corps. Over here's the British. Here you have 2nd Army under Dempsey. Down here, starting about Maastricht down toward Luxembourg, is the 1st Army under Hodges. Okay, and then the route of advance is up this road. Now, one of the problems with all these maps, these come out of Cornelius Ryan's. They're about as good as anything I found. One of the problems we have in any of these discussions is that maps just suck. They don't have the right detail. And if you take a look, I've tried to summarize as best I can what the requirements were. Okay, and the fact of the matter is there were basically 8 bridges, including 3 1,000-foot span bridges along the way. The ones marked here in blue are alternate bridges. They could have sufficed. The 82nd tried to take, the 101st tried to take Best and San. And so let's, when we talk about those easy missions, British Airborne had an entire division, not all on day one, but they had an entire division to secure one of 2 bridges. They secured 1/2 of one bridge. The 101st, down here at the bottom, had to secure a minimum of 4 bridges, and 2 of those were defended by 88 millimeter guns. Now that's the main gun from a tank, the Tiger tank. Okay, they had to secure 4 bridges. Here on the Domel, there was actually 4 opportunities to cross the Domel. I've only highlighted one. And they had to get the Willems Canal, the Awe River, and the Domel and the Wilhelmina. Okay, so this is the one that gets blown, and in the movie, they have to rebuild the Bailey Bridge, right? So this one causes them an 8 to 12 hour delay. But once they get over that, these other bridges are secured adequately that the race up the road and across the Rhine is pretty fast, and 30 Corps makes good. So this whole myth that 30 Corps was slow is, I don't think so. There was a delay. When they arrived at Nijmegen, they were behind schedule, but not by much. We're talking a few hours, depending on how you look at it. But of all the operations, of all the airborne divisions, if we look here in the Nijmegen, the Grave to Nijmegen region, the 82nd Airborne had to secure a minimum of 3 bridges, and in reality, the string of 3 bridges right here are all in the middle of their drop zone. So the reality is they had to secure a minimum of 1 to, this is the Heumann Bridge, or Heumann Bridge. This was the main one. The idea was to come up, cross the Grave, turn to the right, cross over, and then approach the road bridge from here. But they had to secure 3 bridges, including 2 of the 3 1,000-foot spans, and defend against this alleged threat from the east, this large armored force, which later we hear about the 1,000-tank myth that evolves at some point. That's not easy, okay? None of these operations. This was not easy. The British operation at Arnhem was not easy. The American operation here in the 101st was not easy. And when you start to disparage the nature of the mission so that you can justify your agenda that the Americans are to blame for everything, it's like, yeah, okay. In the most simplistic way, yes, the San Bridge, the Americans failed to get that bridge, as if the enemy doesn't get a vote. And this decision right here turns out to be the crucial one. Why didn't they secure this bridge on day 1? Okay, and that's the one that probably has the most legitimate rationale behind it, and personally, it's the one that I actually tend to agree with. Now, if you look at this, I mentioned there's maps are the problem with maps is they all suck. This map right here shows you where they are at the end of the 26th, and I hope I don't get censored by YouTube. But this is the road right here. Now, if you notice here, this little town right here, okay, that's my little circle got moved. That's right here, okay. In this map, it wasn't even in the secured zone of the Allies. So when we talk about easy missions, there is no easy mission on this, and that's just ridiculous. And this does lead us to one of the points that I make. Remember those boundaries we talked about on the battlefield? Notice here, 30 Corps, here's 12th Corps boundary, here's 30 Corps, here's 30 Corps, and here's 8 Corps. 30 Corps had a very narrow corridor. flank security belonged to 8th Corps and 12th Corps. And when I talk about flank security, I'm talking about operational, flank security. But in a later conversation, if anyone's interested, we need to talk about flank security within the corridor because it's important. And this is one of the things that 30 Corps didn't do correctly, at least not in my opinion. So I'm going to start off with the view that this disparaging and trying to make your case on the basis of Americans failing in their easy missions is horseshit. Now, if we overlay those same two maps here, you could see here, let's talk about flank security. So one of his major arguments is that the Americans failed in flank security. Well, there's several levels of flank security. First of all, there's the flank security within the corridor itself, and we'll talk about that next. The 30 Corps security along the corridor. Then there's the flank security of the corridor, provided on the left by the 12th and on the right by the 8th British Corps. And then there's what you would call operational security, which is further afield. So if this is the approximate corridor, let's take a look at where First Army's obligations would have been. First Army's boundary with the British was right about in here. So their attack would have been down here, and it would have been squeezed between the west wall, the Siegfried line. And remember, this is supposed to be 8th Corps right in this area right here. Okay? So regardless of what American failures might have occurred on flanking activities, the decision point is up here. It's 50 or more miles away from anywhere that the Americans might have been operating. Remember, Overloon, I think, is like right about in this little spot right here. At some point after the operation, the 7th Armor gets up into this Overloon area, and that's about 50 miles. And if you look from Nijmegen to where the jump-off points of the First Army would have been, it's 100 miles. So the argument that the United States failed in its duties to provide flank support is absolutely utter horseshit. Okay? And you can see you just got the little span there that shows the distance to Nijmegen. Okay, so this is the thing that I'm talking about in terms of if there is a flaw in flank security, it was the tactical level security that was the real issue. So imagine the 30 Corps is moving along the road, and as they go along, one of the things that should have happened is forces from 30 Corps should have been branching off to set up blocking positions as they go along. Okay, and if this is really an armored force, it's going to take armor to stop armor, okay? The 82nd Airborne is not capable of doing 2 major bridges, 4 subordinate bridges, and securing the town of Nijmegen and providing security against a large armored force. So the failure to build into the plan an echelon peeling off to the right, if you will, at the critical stages. Remember, this was in British intelligence. They said this was here. So the fact that 30 Corps didn't, as soon as Vandelier's guys, the Grenadier Guards got across the road here, the very next organization behind him should have been an armor unit that peels, or any tank unit that would peel off to the right and set up blocking positions and reinforce, the positions of the airborne that were there. So if there was an issue of flank security, it was at the tactical level, not at the operational level. It wasn't the First Army that was to blame. Maybe the 8th Corps could have provided, but by nature, remember, an airborne operation with a salient, the flanking forces of the 12th and the 8th are not expected to keep up with them. They've got to cross the same water obstacles, and they don't have the airborne to do it. So even within the 2nd Army, it's absolutely ridiculous to think that the 8th Corps could have provided flank security at the Reichswald area in vicinity of Nijmegen. That was a responsibility of 30 Corps. And if there was a mistake in 30 Corps' operation, that was it. Okay, one of the next arguments he makes is diverting of resources. This is horseshit. Once again, it's all we got to call it what it is. There are no reported reports of significant stoppages by 30 Corps inside the corridor due to the lack of food, fuel, or ammo. You can probably find an example where a tank or a platoon of tanks ran out of gas or ran out of something. But that is almost certainly a limitation of the main supply route for this operation was a single road. There is no reported example. The delays that occurred for 30 Corps were delays at the San Bridge and at the Nijmegen Bridge and fighting in Nijmegen to get to the Nijmegen Bridge and secure it. So there is, and of course they were waiting. Remember, we all know the scene where they're bringing the boats up to do the amphibious assault. The whole Nijmegen delay was not a logistical delay. It wasn't. It doesn't matter what Hodges sent to who. It doesn't matter what resources the Americans shuffled around internally for themselves. If Operation Market Garden had been successful and First Army had then been unable to advance that 7th Armored, for example, up along the flanks toward Overloon, if they had been failed to provide operational support going forward of a successful operation, and or Dempsey had been deprived of resources so that once he got across the bridge he was stuck because he had no gas and no bullets, then the case for diversion of resources to Patton's Third Army might have had some merit. But in the absence of the success of that operation, inside of the context of Operation Market Garden and 30 Corps, there was no diversion by Hodges and Bradley down to Patton that had any impact on the operational success or failure of Operation Market Garden. So if we come back to the beginning and wrap it up, I want to compliment Lewis on the work that he did with this particular series. It's a lot of good work. And he does make some interesting observations and assessments that I think are not normal. I think too many people do buy into the Cornelius Ryan version of events. And as a consequence, there's a lot of Monty blaming and things like that. He's right. TIK is right. Lewis is right. There is a degree of culpability. But, as I said before, there's also the matter of context. And for that I'll come back to my general narratives. And for those who are come to this and actually sat here and watched this discussion now, thank you for your patience. What I would like to see is engagement in discussions about the plan. Was it good? Was it bad? And remember, the Americans were big contributors to this plan, right? So Brereton and Williams were part of the plan, making of the plan. So if it's a bad plan, it doesn't mean that it's all Monty's fault, right? It doesn't mean that it's all Browning's fault. It'd be curious to have discussions that are not so skewed by nationalistic agenda to see what decisions were made by Brereton, what decisions were made by Williams and Horrocks and Browning, etc. And did they were there things that could have been and should have been done that were known at the time, right? The second guessing them after the fact is not what we're talking about. Some of these decisions they knew at the time when they choose whether to land at Oosterbeek or whether they land at Driel. They had those two choices at the time. Were their decisions good, bad, or indifferent? Was the architecture of that battle any good or not? And I'd love to have those kinds of discussions and maybe make a more detailed video on some of the specific pieces and parts. You know, does anyone agree or disagree on the slow thing? I think 30 Corps, you know, what were the things that caused them to be late? Was it their fault? Was there, you know, incompetencies? Were there things they could have done to improve the operation that they could have known and should have known at the time, or did know at the time? For example, the threat of the tanks in the Reichswald. You know, with Gavin, it's more or less, okay, the only question would come down to is, could the operation probably have been architected slightly differently to where the bridges were the priority and he would have gone to the bridges first and he wouldn't have been quite as worried about his security, his flank security. You know, these are the kinds of discussions I would like to have. And for those of you, again, who are new to my channel, this is my first go at it. And I apologize, it's a little bit lengthy. Got to work on, you know, efficiency here as I go forward. But I would love to have your feedback. And if you have different thoughts and opinions, that's great. But if you're going to be a troll, you know, if you're just going to, if you're going to come with an agenda, you know, go somewhere else. But if you want to come for a discussion, then let's have that discussion. And then at the end of those discussions, we can play the blame game. I don't have a problem with that. But let's learn about this battle. It's an important battle. It's one of the most significant coalition activities of the war. I mean, obviously things like D-Day, the major invasions, right? And this is right up there with them. And let's try and learn how to benefit from these mistakes, because we live in a world that is dangerous, and we need to stop being, you know, four countries separated by the common language, whether you're Canadian or American or New Zealand, and we have our other friends in Europe and Asia. It's important for us, in my view, to have meaningful dialogue, learn the lessons that can be learned, and make our alliances better and make our relations between our countries and our peoples better. I think this is way underestimated in the current affairs. And in recent years, you know, America's been, well, not just America. These nationalistic America firsters, and they're all over the world. It's, you know, the reality is we live in an interconnected world, and we are dependent on each other. Not one country in Europe is big enough to do it alone, and America's big enough to do it alone, but we're not in Europe. You know, we got to ship everything across the ocean. So whether we like it or not, we're part of coalitions, and we need to understand how those things work. So please, join in the conversation. Leave your comments, and let's see if we can learn more about this operation and learn from each other and engage in some type of meaningful dialogue without all the nationalistic crap. All right, have a good evening. Thanks for watching.